Hello, this is Paola Harris, and I am here with Sid Goldberg and with Ross Coulthart, whose new book is causing a stir. Several new books have come out this year. And the reason why I'm supporting this particular one is because he is an investigative journalist. He is not a ufologist. So he came into this with a historical perspective. In fact, the book is chronologically historical. And also because he is from Australia, and you might tell us a little bit about your background, you've included Australian cases. Okay, welcome, welcome.
It's a real pleasure to be here, Paola. How did I get into this? I've worked for 37 years as an investigative journalist for TV, newspapers, and sometimes radio. I've worked mainly in Australia, but I have freelanced around Southeast Asia, and I've worked for some of the world's top newspapers, reporting from war zones and nasty conflicts all around the world. I started out, funnily enough, training as a lawyer, as an attorney, and I practiced briefly, was admitted to the bar, and was looking forward to a splendiferous life as a lawyer, making a lot of money, and I got bored witless, and I loved investigating stuff, and it was my curiosity, frankly, that undid me so many times when I was working for clients. You know, when you have a major oil company that asks you to work up a legal contract for something, you just can't help but look at all the other files, and it was fascinating. It made me realize that what I was more drawn to was telling stories and investigating and using the skill set that I've acquired in law, which was to essentially assimilate vast amounts of information and condense it into something simple. And journalism, which is essentially good old-fashioned footwork. And so I worked for the New Zealand Herald. I was first based in New Zealand. I was originally born in the UK. My father was convinced there was going to be a nuclear war, so he moved us to New Zealand in contemplation of that probability. And mercifully, it never happened so far. And while I was living in New Zealand, I guess one of the seminal incidents that woke me up to the phenomenon was the Kaikoura UFO incident in the north of the South Island of New Zealand in Christmas of 1978, when I was a 16-year-old teenage boy. And like most Kiwis, I thought little of it at the time when the government, the Air Force, made an announcement 3 weeks after the incident that there was nothing in it. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, it's a non-event. It's easily explained. What the pilot of this cargo aircraft saw in his cockpit late one night wasn't a flying saucer. It was reflections of squid boat lights, fishing boat lights off clouds. End of story. And if it wasn't that, because it's possibly it wasn't, it was probably the planet Venus. And that sounded plausible to me. And I went on with my life and went to university and studied law. And in the course of that, I met an air traffic controller by the name of John Cordy. And I also met other people at the Wellington Airport, which was the airport across Cook Strait, the body of water between the North and the South Island of New Zealand. And Wellington Airport sat on the very end of the North Island of New Zealand, looking towards the South Island. And the incident that I was talking about had actually happened way, way up on the northernmost tip, the northeastern tip of the South Island. So they had very good radar from 30 miles away of what they saw. And the Air Force report, I remember I was at a party and I spoke to an informant who worked at Wellington Airport at the time. And I said, oh, it's a real shame your radar was broken. And he went, radar wasn't broken that night? What do you mean the radar was broken? This is one of our major airports in New Zealand. Radar doesn't break. And I said, well, that's what the Royal New Zealand Air Force report says. And certainly it suggested that the radar wasn't functioning properly. And in the end, when I started the research for my book, I tracked down John Cordy, who's now in his 80s. And John said, that's rubbish, absolute bloody rubbish. No truth in it at all. The radar wasn't busted. There was nothing wrong with it. And what I saw was objects at 14,000 feet maneuvering around the aircraft. And it was interesting because it rocked my worldview because I have to admit, as a journalist, I giggled. I used to laugh at the phenomenon of UFOs. I thought it was a joke that people were obsessed with UFOs. And I've got friends who told me that they've seen UFOs, and rather uncharitably, I've laughed at them. And so I was very, very, very dismissive. And then I guess instinct told me to keep on looking. And I found Quentin Fogarty, who was the cameraman who'd shot that vision for a television station here in Australia. And he happened to be in New Zealand with his family. Oddly enough, his little baby boy at the time was a guy called Ben, and Ben went on to become my cameraman at 60 Minutes Australia, which is how I got on to Quentin and how I renewed this friendship. And it was very funny because Quentin said to me, he said, look, Ross, we were standing in the cockpit of that plane as these craft came towards us. And believe me, we saw very clear craft. And he was filming with a 16mm camera film. And the film's quite striking, quite astonishing in its own right, because you can see a kind of a plasma glow and some kind of a shape behind that glow. But to be honest, at the time, I was watching it on a New Zealand black and white television set and frankly, didn't think much of the imagery. But to hear from Quentin and then one of his colleagues, who also I hadn't realized happened to be on the plane with him, was a guy called Dennis Grant. And Dennis was one of Australia's top news anchors, one of the top political reporters for Australia. He'd gone on to a highly successful career here in Australia, an eminent, well-respected political reporter who knew all the prime ministers and reported everything in Australian politics for decades, an absolute household name. And I contacted Dennis and he was delighted to speak to me. And he said, yes, Ross, I was there too. And he said, we were literally talking to the Wellington radar people. And I said, John Cordy? And he went, yeah, I think that's the name. The Wellington radar people. And they were saying, it's at 14,000 feet, it appears to be in front of your aircraft. And he was going, and I was looking at it. It was straight there in front of us, maneuvering around us. And I think that for me was the beginning of a realization that, you see, we have a saying in journalism, and Paola, you'd know this, always assume, I'll use a polite word, a screw up rather than a conspiracy. Always assume a screw up before a conspiracy, because conspiracies rarely happen. Governments are utterly hopeless at keeping most secrets. You know, politicians invariably, when there's a leak in Australia, and they do this a lot in Australia, they don't do it as much in your country, but I've done interviews with ministers of the Crown, like the people who head government departments, the politicians who lead the departments, and they'll leak me something. And then a week later, when my story runs, they'll call a federal police leaks inquiry to investigate who was the source of this outrageous leak that has disrupted his department. And so, you know, the idea that governments can conceal things and conspire, politicians can't shut their mouths. You know, they're incapable, I believe, of keeping secrets. But in this particular incident, I've been persuaded that there was a cover-up, and that there were people in the New Zealand Air Force who were badgered by the Americans, God bless them, to make this go away. And as a member of the New Zealand public at the time, it was quite a realization for me early in my research to realize that these cover-ups really do happen. And then when I came to Australia, I always had that kind of niggling interest in the phenomenon. And there were a lot of reports that I'd heard about. I'd heard about Westall, 1966.
That's in the book, by the way. I want to tell people the Westall case is in the book. It's also in James Fox's movie, The Phenomena, thanks to James Rigney. And that is about landing in a children's, with a lot of children in a schoolyard, like the one in
Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, yeah.
And Wales, by the way. Yeah, there's all of sightings all over the world from these schools. But if I'm going chronologically, the next story that really twigged my interest was I was working as an investigative reporter for Australia's top public affairs program, a bit like your PBS Frontline. It was called Four Corners on the Australian public broadcaster. And Four Corners is an old granny of a show, a very well-respected show. And I wasn't doing a story on UFOs. God forbid, they would never have let me do a story on UFOs. But I was talking to very senior members of the Australian Air Force about another issue, which doesn't really matter for the telling of this story. And we were filming with them all day. And at the end of a long day, they invited us to the officers' mess at this airstrip and basically said, "Do you want a beer?" And we sat down and we had a beer, and there's a room full of other pilots. It's quite cool because you're talking about jet fighter pilots, and there's F-18s out the door. And I'm thinking, this is exciting. And then finally, this very senior officer leaned forward like this over the table and he said, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. Why don't you journalists do stories about UFOs?" And I laughed. I said, "Because they're bullshit, UFOs, they're just rubbish." And he went, "No, they're not." And I wish I could tell you who this person was, because they were, in fact, quite a well-known public figure in Australia, a very, very eminent military official. And anyway, the long and the short of it was, in the course of that evening, they were just summonsing over pilots saying, "Oh, Charlie, come over here. Bert, come over here." And all these pilots were telling me about stories they'd had. One of the most shocking to me was a P-3 Orion pilot, which is a surveillance aircraft that goes out deep. And in those days, it went out deep into the Indian Ocean looking for Soviet ships and taking photographs of them. And the pilot, with his commanding officer's assent, told me how he had these craft come up beside him in the flight. And they'd taken photographs of them and given them to the Air Force. And so then that led me naturally to the Australian archives. And I barely had any knowledge of what was in the Australian archives on the phenomenon. But I was astonished, because just like happened in the Nevada test range when you guys were letting off nuclear bombs, Australia was the site for where the British tested their nuclear weapons in the 1950s at a place called Maralinga. And they also tested their ICBM missiles at a place in the same area called Woomera. And these were vast open tracts of outback desert, empty, or so they thought, mainly, sadly, full of transitory Aboriginal people who were essentially nomadic and living off the land. And a lot of them suffered terribly as a result of these explosions. But the upshot was that when I went through the archives, there was just the most incredible data in there, recorded by our Air Force, very official sightings reports that recorded, just like at your Los Alamos and your Nevada test range, incredible, fast moving objects doing impossible things, hair turns, 90-degree turns at tens of thousands of miles an hour, tracked on radar, seen by eminent military officials and recorded in reports that were filed away. And I remember sitting in an office once and showing them to a colleague and saying, "Get a load of these." And it was at that point I realized just how big the stigma is with the phenomenon, because I guess one of the things about me is I've never been discouraged from investigating stories just because they're controversial. I did a story once about a doctor who was doing horrible things to women. He was actually, while they were under anesthetic, he was actually circumcising them and removing their sexual pleasure, removing their clitoris. And it was an act of sadistic crime by this doctor. And it was interesting because when I started investigating it, it was obvious that other journalists had been aware of it, but it was just such a controversial subject. Nobody wanted to go near it because it was women's business and it was embarrassing. And so we did this story, and it just exploded. It just went nuts because people were really interested, as, by the way, has my stories on the phenomenon that I've done on Australian television. They've had an unprecedented audience. And I guess to answer your question, and I'm sorry, Paola, I answered in a very long and elaborate way, my interest has been twigged by the simple fact that when I applied the skill set that I apply to any story as an investigative journalist, I freely admit I was nervous because this is such a stigmatized, taboo subject. I was thinking, oh my God, I'm going to do a story about UFOs. I'm going to write a book about UFOs. But the more I looked, when you allow for the fact that, yes, there are some people who are mentally unwell who claim to have had UFO sightings, that doesn't discount all of those sightings. And even when I went down to the absolute best sightings reports, there was a strong kernel of truth that made me think, wow, there really is something to this. And then when I started engaging with people, both in my government, privately, literally knocking on the doors of old boffins who'd worked for our equivalent of your DARPA, nothing like your DARPA, but scientists who'd worked in our defence establishment, all of them were very wide open to the probability that there is a phenomenon that is real. And a number of them directed me to the work of a fascinating guy called Harry Turner, who was in the 1970s one of Australia's most eminent scientists working for the Defence Department. And I was amused because I later on found Harry's name on sightings reports from Maralinga, where he'd been there and investigated sightings on the nuclear test range when they were letting off bombs. And when they let off bombs, all of a sudden these objects would appear over the nuclear test site. And Harry was the young physicist that they brought in from Melbourne University to investigate these sightings. And when I went through the archives and extracted different reports from the government archives, from our Air Force in particular, Harry had written an analysis of the phenomenon in the early 1970s that is deadly to any notion that this is taboo or stigma. Here was a clear-sighted, clear-minded scientist, not a nutter, somebody who was very driven by science, looking at the evidence and basing his conclusions not only on the evidence that he'd seen, but on conversations he'd had with people in his role in America. He was very, very well connected because of his role in the nuclear weapons testing with people at the Nevada test range. And Harry flat out asserted that there was a cover-up inside the American government about what they knew about the phenomenon. And he even talked about retrieved craft. I'm reading these once top secret documents from Australia's Joint Intelligence Office, which is a bit like your Defence Intelligence Agency. And I'm thinking, why is this not public information? Why isn't this all over the newspapers? Why haven't we done major stories about this issue? And I guess that process, if you like, that layering of my own personal experience investigating a UFO sighting, plus going to the government archives, talking to the scientists, talking to the pilots in our Air Force, and then hearing from them, yeah, this is real, Ross. You should be engaging with this. We're as bemused as you are why the media treat this with such stigma. And it's really interesting because to this day, I mean, I have my enemies, like all journalists do in the media in Australia. And there was a major newspaper in Australia recently took a swipe at me saying, oh, yes, and look where Ross Coulthart's career is as an investigative journalist. He's reduced to writing books on UFOs. And I have to admit, I was a bit crestfallen. I was thinking, oh, that was a nasty dig, And then it was very funny because my phone just went nuts. All these senior officials in government departments ringing me going, hey, are you doing a book on UFOs? Listen, can I tell you about what I saw? And you need this report, seriously. You need to dig into this. It was actually fantastic because all of a sudden, all this information just came rolling in the door. And frankly, Paola and Sid, I don't care if the rest of the mainstream media in my country don't investigate this phenomenon, and indeed in your country, because I'm a pig in mud right now. It's fantastic. I've never seen so many fruitful areas for investigation, so many rich lodes and nuggets for what we call in my business a bloody good dig. And I'm really enjoying the fact that every day I am completely overwhelmed with emails, social media messages, letters,
Does this
phone
sound
calls.
familiar, Sid? Does this sound familiar to you? We have, let's let Sid jump in because, Sid, you've met Ross for the first time tonight. And everybody knows Sid is a two-time award-winning producer. And tell us, Sid, what do you think about what's going on in Australia that isn't going on here?
Well, what I found fascinating, Ross, and you touched on this, was that the audience response in Australia to bringing this story forward has been very electric. And I'm curious to know, what does that mean to you when the public is not looking at the phenomena and the story as a bunch of nutters, to use your term, but they're enthusiastically coming to you, a mainstream award-winning journalist known not only in Australia, but outside. You've committed a couple of years of your life to writing this book. There must be something to it. What's going on?
Well, I can tell you the response has just been insane. I mean, as you know, I made a film called The UFO Phenomenon, which we originally made for the network here in Australia that I work with, Channel 7 Australia, which is one of Australia's biggest commercial free-to-air television networks. And
I
we
saw
ran
it, by the way, and I thought it was really, really good.
Oh, thank you. But we ran it over 2 weeks. We ran an hour, 10 minutes one week, and then I think 20 or 30 minutes the following week. And we've put it up on YouTube. It rated really well in Australia on free-to-air TV, and I think it was downloaded on the app and seen on free-to-air TV well over 1,500,000 times, which is huge in Australia. I mean, most TV shows in Australia, even on prime time now, they're very lucky if they break 1 million views. But then when we put it up on YouTube, it just went nuts because everybody around the world was watching my film. And the best thing you can say as a journalist is, the most flattering thing is that people are actually engaging with the stories you do. I mean, I've done stories where I think, God, this is it. This is Watergate. It's outrageous. I'm going to break this wide open and people are going to watch it and they're just going to be as angry as I am about it. And then frankly, nobody watches and it dies without trace. But this one just went nuts. And I think we've had it up on several iterations on YouTube. We had a music copyright problem, so we had to take it down once and then another time. But all combined, I think we've had well over 6.5 million to 7 million views in just a few months, which is, for Australia, insane. That's just insane levels of viewership. We're only a country of 20 million people. So, the audience has come from all over the world. I'm gratified too that people are obviously interested in developing more information and reading my book. And what it means for me as a journalist is it makes me think, yeah, hell yeah, I'm in there like Flynn. I'll keep on digging. And if there's a way of funding investigative journalism to get me to the parts of the world that I want to get to investigate this.
And I'm going to jump in there with you. You're not going to get away with this alone. Everything. I just come back from Spain, from Barcelona, Spain. I've done 3 stories, which are going to show here in Laughlin. 3 amazing stories. And it was all out of my pocket. So yes. Yeah. If you find a way of funding this, let me know.
Yeah, but I mean, I agree with you. It is very, very hard. But look, what I'm fascinated by is even my network were taken aback. I mean, in Australia, we take the piss all the time. So, it wasn't uncommon for colleagues to have tinfoil hats on my desk when I first did a UFO story, and everybody sort of took the mickey. But as the ratings have just gone through the roof, people have gone, you know what? We've missed this. And so just the other day, one of my rival networks, Channel 9, I just heard that they're doing their own UFO investigative story because they're jumping on the bandwagon now. And it's great, and the best form of imitation is flattery. It's great. I'm very happy that people are doing it because the mainstream should be engaging with this. And the childish, infantile, puerile, God, it fucks me off the way they behave. Sorry, are we allowed to swear on this, by the way? I don't know whether people at Laughlin will be offended. But it really gives me the shits the way some people in mainstream media resort to adolescent, puerile humor and kind of giggle like schoolboys when they're confronted with a story about UFOs. It's almost anti-intellectual because, to me, the evidence is incontrovertible that there is a phenomenon, that it's real, that in an unprecedented statement from the period since Project Blue Book, where essentially the US Air Force was maintaining the position, and so was mine and the British Air Force. All around the Five Eyes nations, all around the world, for much of the last 60 years, we've been told that this is all bollocks, it's all rubbish. And, you can forget about UFOs, it's rubbish, just ignore it. It's, stigmatized, don't go near it, it'll ruin your career. The number of conversations I've had as a journalist in my career where I've been told, oh, no, mate, we don't do UFO stories. And I go, why? And they go, well, it's all bullshit. And I go, who says? And it's funny, when you drill down, it all goes back to essentially CIA disinformation. And it's there in the CIA archives for anybody who cares to listen. I gave a speech the other day to a group here in Australia, and I was talking about how the paperwork shows very, very clearly that in the 1940s and the 1950s, some of the vanguard, some of the cadre of people who were leading the chase to get to the bottom of this mystery were very, very senior people in your US government, Paola. These were reputable people like the former director of the CIA, Roscoe Hillenkotter, people who founded NICAP. These were military officials who were admitting, this is real, we can't explain this, we need to investigate this. And then like an iron door, bang, at the beginning of the 1960s became this policy of essentially shutting down and stigmatizing and treating with taboo the whole subject matter. And boy, it really worked, because it's essentially muted a lot of the mainstream media coverage even now. I mean, I love what Leslie Kean, my friend Leslie Kean, and Ralph Blumenthal from the New York Times did with Helene Cooper, breaking open the story in October and I think December of 2017 and since. But really, I don't know why a major newspaper like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times isn't devoting full-time reporters to covering the phenomenon, when you have the US government admitting on the record definitively that there is a mystery it cannot explain. That these videos, these Navy videos, which appear to show objects doing things that, in the words of Lou Elizondo, defy known human science, they're exceeding speeds that we can achieve with any of our top jet fighters or experimental aircraft. When you have the admission being made by our Navy, your Navy, that it can't explain this phenomenon, and when you have officials of the credibility of Lou Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, talking candidly about the fact that there is a cover-up, that there are things that are not being talked about by the US government. I don't know why the mainstream media isn't on this like a bloody dog on a bone. You should be chewing the digging like hell, getting in there, kicking doors in, asking questions. And more importantly, every member of the public doesn't realize that they have power, that politicians are scared of upsetting their electorate. So if you, the public, make this an electorate issue, raise it with your elected official, your elected representative, your senator, your, what do you call it over there, your member of Congress, they'll have to listen, especially if you write a letter. Don't just ring and send an email. Write a formal letter and demand that these things get investigated, because we really are now at an unprecedented level of proof. Not since the 1950s have we had government officials or previous government officials making admissions with such implications for humanity. And I really think it's long overdue for the mainstream media to get on the bandwagon and start digging, not be credulous. I've investigated quite a few things in the course of this that I think are rubbish. People, I won't say what, but people have come to me with allegations about sightings, and I think I've been able to disprove them or establish in my own mind that what they think they saw wasn't what they saw. But what is needed is rigorous investigative journalism that starts digging into this issue in a way that hasn't been done before. And I don't get it. I really don't get it, because I'm a member of one of the world's most eminent investigative journalists groups, the Investigative the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists based out of Washington, DC. You know, we've been involved in breaking stories on big tobacco, on massive tax evasion, illegal tax avoidance. And I know a story, and my colleagues know a story when they see one. And it's fascinating to me because it's kind of got around the group that I'm the crazy UFO guy amongst their colleagues. And I get these phone calls every now and then from some of my ICIJ colleagues saying, "Hey, Ross, I just want you to know, I think you're onto a good thing here. You know, my government, I spoke to a minister in my government and he's telling me X, Y, and Z. And I'm saying, well, why don't you investigate it? Why don't you do a story about it? And there's still this stigma. There's still this incredible taboo that's attached to the subject. And essentially it's fear of ridicule. And what I've come to realize as a journalist that's now spent a hell of a lot of time digging into this issue is the public doesn't realize they've been played, and neither does the media. The media has been played most of all. Never before, I think, has there been such a successful disinformation campaign to muzzle the media from asking questions. And I do think it's about to change. I do see a shift occurring, but it's going to be very, very slow. And I think a lot depends on how willing US elected representatives are to push for oversight hearings and to get people deposed. Because one of the things that I did as part of my investigation was I sat back and I thought, okay, if I was an aerospace scientist or an intelligence official that knows something about the big secret of UFOs, let's assume that there is one, what would I most want? And frankly, what they would most want is their anonymity. They're terrified of being found out because for them, the crack cocaine candy in their lives is being able to keep their security oath, their security clearance, their top secret SCI compartmentalized clearances. It's how they make their money. They make their money by basically working in a massive, defense aerospace industry. And if they get even a whiff of suspicion about their credentials, then they are, their SCI clearance is dropped. And so I wrote letters. I wrote good old fashioned letters rather than ringing people or emailing them. I wrote good old fashioned snail mail letters to well over 160, 170 people all over the world, but mainly in the United States. And I waited. And then a couple of months on, I started getting letters back telling me how to communicate with them, or I'd start getting encrypted messages, and people were willing to talk. And what fascinated me was these people were telling me that I was onto a very important story, and they were encouraging me to dig. And they were gratified that somebody from mainstream media was digging into this issue. Gratified and I think a little bit surprised, to be honest. But I've had the privilege of engaging with some very honorable, patriotic, good human beings who think that it's time America, the world, knew what they know. And they've admitted to me they can't see any good reason why it shouldn't be public information. And they are talking about recovered, non-human technology. They're talking about, in some cases, craft. Now, I'll never glibly accept that just on its face because I want to see the craft. I really want to see the technology. I want to believe based on hard evidence. But prima facie, my suspicions are raised that the US, for whatever reason, has kept a secret for now 60, 70 years plus, which I suspect the phenomenon is pushing the agenda. I'm told by...
I like that phrase, so I really want to stop you there. Because you're one of the only people that I've ever heard actually say that. because that means that there's some kind of interaction.
I think that there is an awareness among some of the officials in your government, Paola, that I've spoken to, that they have to be far more open than they've chosen to be in the last 60 years, because they're concerned that the phenomenon is manifesting itself far more obviously over military installations, in encounters with military pilots. In some sightings recently, I'm told there have been as many as 50 objects. Let's use a neutral term. The people I spoke to used the word craft, but 50 objects around the airframe of the aircraft that saw them. I'm told photographs have been taken, videos have been taken. Now, I can't accept that on its own. You know, one of the things I'm always careful of as a journalist is disinformation. You know, I think there's always the possibility, you know, we're at an acute period at the moment where, sadly, there is a risk of a confrontation with China. I mean, I've got officials in my government here in Australia who candidly tell me that they think that war with China is imminent, that a confrontation in the Taiwan Strait is only a matter of time. So it could very well be that this is the US trying to give its adversaries, potential rivals, the willies, a scare, suggesting to them that it's got ace in the hole technology that it might pull out in the event of a conflict. But so many people are saying this to me. I've spoken to people who've told me that they've seen demonstrations of anti-gravitic technology that's in the possession of the United States government. I don't know what to make of that, because I haven't seen it myself. But I certainly, one of the people that I spoke to for my book who went on the record with me was a very honourable man, an incredibly former senior geek for the Navy, a guy called Nat.
I noticed that last chapter, and that was the major. I don't like the word whistleblower. You called him honorable man, which is the way you should look at it.
Yeah, I mean,
last part of your book, you have that testimony.
Nat is one of the people I wrote to, and when I corresponded with him, it was obvious he was unwell, and his daughter Celia explained to me that he was slowly dying from a very bad form of cancer. And so I guess with the knowledge of his imminent death, Nat was more candid with me than perhaps he might have been a few years earlier. And we kind of made friends. We spoke a lot. He loved the fact that there was something to divert him from the fact that he was slowly dying in his house in Baltimore. And we talked about the bushfires in Australia, which were happening at the time. And he was really keen for me to use a particular type of Russian bomber. And he wanted me to contact my government and tell them about the Russian water bomber that he could put me onto. And it slowly emerged that I was talking to the former director of science and technology development, essentially the former head of R&D, research and development for the US Navy, a guy who'd had unhindered access to China Lake, and a guy who slowly one day admitted to me, after many weeks of conversation, that yes, when I asked him, were you ever read into the program, the UFO program, there was this pause. And he said, yes. And I almost fell off my chair. And he talked about how he had been briefed that the United States government had recovered craft, multiple craft, non-terrestrial technology, non-human technology. And I pushed him and pushed him and pushed him. I said, did you ever see these craft? And he went, no. And the one thing he did tell me was that when he left the Navy, he was running a company called NKA, Nat Kovitz Associates, and he specialized in a particular type of electron beam welding, which was a type of welding, really strong welds that they do for things like to bond two different types of metal for, say, an aircraft undercarriage for, say, like the C5 Galaxy. You do electron beam welding to hold those welds together. Really, really strong weld, and with an almost indiscernible bead. If you've ever done welding, to conventional weld leaves a very clear bead. this didn't have a B. And probably because of that, one day when he was in his new business at NKA, he got a phone call from, guess what, the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base Foreign Technology Division. And they asked him to come down to Wright-Pat under security cover and look at something. And he tells me that he was taken underground and shown what he immediately assumed to be a broken off piece of a bulkhead, about 4 foot square, incredibly light. And he was asked to look at it and tell them whether he thought it was electron beam welding that combined the metals in it. And I asked him what the metals were that were bonded in it, and he wouldn't tell me. He obviously thought that was security significant. But he said to me, Ross, when I looked at that metal with every available piece of technology that I had to my disposal, including an electron microscope, it was obvious to me that this was metal that was bonded in a way I'd never seen before. It was bonded at the atomic level. It was layered at the atomic level. There was no weld. Whatever had built this, it was like it had been built with a three-dimensional atomic leveler, just layered atoms on top of one another. He said it was just absolutely baffling, and whatever the technology was, he wanted to know more about it. But it had frustrated him, which is one of the reasons why he told me about it, because he was on a strict need to know only. And once he'd inspected that piece of bulkhead and realized that it wasn't bonded the way they suspected it might have been bonded, he was basically pushed out of the building and told to forget about it. And that was all he ever knew. But he did tell me that he was read into a UFO program, and he told me that there were active efforts to back engineer, he'd been told, this non-terrestrial technology.
Ross,
and then he...
Oh, sorry, continue.
That's right. No. And then he introduced me to other people.
I was wondering if he shared any insights with you as to where we are today with that back engineering technology.
He inquired for me whether I came to him and I told him that other sources had told me, including people he'd put me onto. Other sources had told me that the US had cracked anti-gravity. And he went away and spoke to a large number of friends of his. And about a week later, he came back to me and told me that as far as he could tell from his US Navy, and he was very specific, from his US Navy sources, he wasn't aware of any such breakthrough. But the information that I have is that the breakthrough came with the US Navy. I'm told that if this is the case, it's compartmentalized and very closely held by people in the US Air Force inside private aerospace. It's nothing to do with anything inside any government agency any longer. That it was previously held within the Department of Energy, which, as you know, has its own security clearances in your country, in America.
I'm going to stop you for 1 minute, because the book that I wrote with Jacques Vallée, that actually Jacques Vallée, authored, has the crash of 1945, and it is in the Department of Energy files. It is not in any Air Force or anything, because it was 1 month after the atomic bomb. So that is a whole other clearance. That is a whole other world. And it is not subject to, oversight by the president or I guess by the Congress. Department of Energy is its own entity.
Well, my understanding is that the DOE was early on excluded from the Freedom of Information Act, but that when it became a prospect that it was going to be subject to the Freedom of Information Act, the program was removed into private aerospace and operates under very strict, much more intense than a waived, unacknowledged special access program is, very, very strict oversight. And if we were to accept the veracity of the so-called Admiral Wilson memo or the EWD notes, the Eric Davis notes, which I think there's some persuasive arguments to suggest that those notes might be genuine. Those notes appear to suggest also that whatever it is that the United States has recovered as being held in private aerospace. And it really does raise, frankly, and this is why I really do think the only way you're ever going to crack this is by getting congressional hearings, or at least perhaps closed hearings. The only way you're ever going to crack this is to call those in the know, to call people like Admiral Tom Wilson, William Perry, former Defence Secretary, to call the people who've run the Special Access Program Oversight Committee, to call former members of the Gang of Eight, to call members of the senior review group that has oversight of special access programs, and to depose them under oath, and maybe also give them an assurance that they're released from any criminal culpability, from any admissions that they make. I'm in favour of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it's very hard to see how, unless there's a secret presidential executive order that goes back decades, it's very, very hard to see how this could possibly be legal. Because if Chris Mellon is telling the truth, when he was the staffer on the Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee, he had pretty much global clearance to see all of the special access programs, all of the waived unacknowledged programs. And he says he never saw any evidence of any kind of back engineering program, crash retrieval program. So if it was withheld from the oversight of the Senate Intelligence Committee, it really does beg the question, who knows? Were presidents told? Were congressmen informed? Does Harry Reid know? Is that why Harry Reid's pushing so hard? Senator Harry Reid, former senator from Utah. Is that why he's Nevada? Sorry, is that why he's pushed? Yeah, is that why he's pushing so hard? I mean, this is one of the things I think that sooner or later, and that's what I tried to do in my book, there was a kind of a moment, probably about 3 months into my research, where I got completely overwhelmed, and I thought, oh God, I'm never going to get on top of this, because there was so much crazy shit. You know, there is so much nonsense in ufology. And so I tried to restrict myself very much at that point to government archives. You know, what's in my government archives, what's in your government archives. And one of the breakthroughs for me was just going through the files that the CIA was forced to declassify, largely as a result of John Podesta, former White House Chief of Staff's great efforts under both Clinton and Obama. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents, many of which haven't yet been properly analysed. And what they tell is quite astonishing. You know, there really was a Project Moondust that was ostensibly just for the retrieval of perhaps Soviet and Chinese space objects that fell to Earth. But it was quite clear that Moondust had a further purpose, and it often involved, according to the documents that are in the CIA archives, the recovery of sources, craft. And some of the accounts and the descriptions in the archives of what people were seeing and sending back to, surprise, surprise, the Foreign Technology Division of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, appear to suggest more spacecraft than just bits of satellites or nose cones of rockets.
Well, you know that the Clifford Stone, and he was a good friend of mine, we're going to do a memorial to him in Laughlin, was part of a Project Moondust and Blue Fly. And,
yep.
and he can't make that up. I mean, he was an Army, he was in the Army, and that was his job. So what you're telling us is that you did your homework. You have,
yeah.
and in fact, there's so much in here. I was even shocked that you had touched on Bigelow's Bass Project, you know, the book that came out, Skinwalker, at the, you've got it in this book before it's even out in the general public. We'd love to talk to you some more, but Sid, will you wrap this up? In this conversation, what have you figured out? Because, you know, Ross has asked some very good questions about mainstream media, about journalism. Why can't we touch this?
Well, as you mentioned, the topic of ridicule and stigma has closed down the discussion for so many years. And I've always found in social situations, the more we talk about something, because as someone in media, I'm given a platform to talk in certain venues that normally people would be ridiculed if they brought up the topic, but I always bring up the topic. And it's interesting because the more we talk about this, the more it's okay to talk about it. And now that mainstream is just scratching the surface, using different people in the way that they're being used to disclose some of this information, it's fascinating. And I think more than anything, when you said the phenomena is what's pushing the agenda, I think that's 100% true. I don't think people in the government, I don't think people in the military would be releasing this information on their own if they didn't have to. So when I was told by a friend in intelligence recently that we are in an open system, meaning that non-terrestrial intelligences are in some way dictating and leading us into an open conversation and open contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, this is the time. It could have happened in 1947. It didn't happen then with the crash of Roswell. Now, the excuse of the Tic Tacs might be the time where this does happen. And if we were going to wind up this conversation, I probably want to ask you one thing, and that is moving forward from what you've been exposed to, what you've written about in your book, and the private conversations you had that didn't make it into your book. What can you tell us about your vision in the near future for our world concerning disclosure?
I think there's an extremely low likelihood of congressional hearings at the moment. I don't see the political will from the political staffers and the congressmen and senators that I've engaged with to make it happen. I think there's almost an embarrassment about the subject, especially with the rise of China right now. But to underline what I said about the phenomenon dictating the agenda, several officials in your US government, Paola, have told me that they're shocked by how much more frequently the phenomenon is manifesting itself. It's becoming far more overt. And I think the simple reason why the Pentagon has made the decision to be more forthcoming and open now is because the gatekeepers of the secret, the generals, the politicians, the aerospace officials who've presided over what is possibly a criminal conspiracy to keep this secret for so long. And I do say that. I do think there is possibly a criminal conspiracy to conceal this. They are worried that they're going to be caught with their pants down, that as the phenomenon becomes more overt, they're going to have to become more transparent and more open. But what I suspect is happening is there's an attempt to control the narrative by keeping the UAP task force focused solely on sightings of objects like the Tic Tac onwards from 2004. Nobody wants to talk about crash retrievals. Nobody wants to talk about recovered technology. And that's hilarious because that's the story. The story is it true? Is it true that the United States has recovered non-human advanced technology and that it's been able to successfully back engineer it? That's the story they don't want us to tell. What they do want is a story where they go, hey guys, we've told you there's a mystery. We've told you UFOs are real, and wow, there they are there. That's where they want you to start. They want you to forget about the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and probably the 40s, where material was recovered, allegedly. Because I think there's a strong possibility or probability that the United States is developing technology in the black that it doesn't want to talk about, that it's keeping it back as ace in the hole technology. And frankly, who can blame them? I would. Let's be honest about it. If I was the president and I'd been briefed about the fact that we've got an absolute kick-ass form of propulsion that would humiliate the Chinese or the Russians if they tried anything on, I'd want to pull it out the hat at the worst possible moment for the Russians or the Chinese. I wouldn't want to show it now. And that's what I think is going on.
Well, we're very grateful to have you. Before we finish, I have to remind you that Sid and I are very international. I have a double passport. I was born in Rome, Italy, so I don't consider any government my government.
Okay.
We're very, and Sid is originally from Canada. And you know something, and you're from Australia. So what's so exciting is that we have an international group here talking at this conference. And we have to look at it. The UFO phenomena is not an American phenomena. It is a worldwide phenomena. And I think that all governments are all the same. And so what has to happen maybe is that the people have to move on this. The people should become interested because it redefines us for us. The fact that we are not alone redefines us. And I've talked to you personally, so I know this touches you personally. And Sid, let's hope we can get him to Laughlin next year. We're going to just push you into it. I hope you come and visit us, and I'm very grateful for this conversation. And thank you too, Sid.
My pleasure, Paola. And Ross, we'll see you in Laughlin next year.
I look forward to that possibility.
Okay.